Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to our panel discussion today, which our panelists will be discussing how to address risk and compliance in your digital transformation strategy. We are joined by Bryan Oak from Searchlight Consulting, who are based in the UK, who will be leading the discussion alongside SafePaaS CEO Adil Khan. So should we jump right in? Adil, over to you.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to our team members and panelists for joining us. And of course, as always, the folks out there attending this webcast, especially in these challenging times where we're looking for a new way to move forward into continue our businesses. So this is very timely. Bryan, thanks for putting this together. My name is Adil Khan. I've been in the governance, risk, and compliance space for about 16 plus years now. Prior to that, I was running a public company here in the US that traded on NASDAQ. So my experience primarily is in finance, internal controls, and technology. So I'm here to really share and support the panel discussion today, share some best practices from the field, and hope to make it insightful for you. I've written a book on this topic. It's called Governance, Risk, and Compliance Handbook, specifically for Oracle applications. That was published back in 2012. It's available on Amazon. I also have presented at all major conferences related to this topic over the many years that I've been involved in. So that's a brief background on me. Bryan, I'll turn it over to you. Bryan, you may be on mute.
Sorry, the automatic one wouldn't work to get it off there. Apologies for that. So yes, Bryan Oak, I'm head of strategy and architecture consulting at Searchlight. We're going to talk a bit more about a little overview of our organisations shortly. But I want to start off by thanking Adil SafePaaS for co-hosting this roundtable discussion and our panelists, who we will meet shortly. So my background is more from an engineering, manufacturing, and supply chain. But in general, the area that I focus on is technology-enabled change and how organisations deliver value from their investment in business technology, enterprise technologies, and enterprise solutions, and how to implement change that sticks. And as part of this discussion, we're going to be talking about the importance of risk, regulatory and non-regulatory compliance, and effective controls when it comes to business process management, digital transformation, and technology-enabled change. Just a bit on our respective organisations before we get into the meat of the discussion. So Searchlight Consulting, we're an independent consulting and delivery organisation, and we help organisations to deliver business improvement through the appropriate use of technology. We help them to make investment decisions that are really aligned to their strategic priorities and prioritise based on tactical need. And we support the requirements analysis, the selection and purchasing around the investments people are making in enterprise solutions and enterprise technology. As clients move into delivery, we help to manage programs, portfolios, and projects to reduce implementation risks. And ultimately, we look to protect our clients' investments, help them to realise the benefits they're expecting from the business case. And we support clients from that initial decision-making and strategy alignment right the way through to delivery, mitigating risk, and into benefits realisation. Adil, do you want to introduce SafePaaS?
Yes, Bryan. So SafePaaS is on a mission to help organization basically reduce the risk and mitigate the risk, remediate the risk in their information systems and information in general, right? So we're here to help customers implement controls that help them achieve their governance goals, their risk and compliance goals. About 250 customers on 5 continents over the last 15 plus years. So most of all, what we bring to the table are these global best practices on how to streamline your risk and controls management programs, your compliance programs, based on the benefits from these customers. The way we address that are through these, I call them Lego bricks, right? So you can build your own roadmap using these Lego bricks on where you see your business going. We can assist you with that, and our partners, such as Searchlight, are extremely useful in this process. So I won't go through all the products. Obviously, this is a quick introduction, but just so you know, we start bottom up in terms of helping companies validate and build their platform. So if you have good risk management practices today, we leverage those. If you want to bring in some best practice, we'll add to those. So whether you want to improve your the way you audit your controls today, the way you assess risk, the way you comply and certify controls, that's all in that SafePaaS platform. It helps you also provide some content. So since we have this knowledge we have built over the years, we provide you a library of risks, a library of rules repository for ERP systems, specifically around the major tier 1 ERP system that we protect. On top of that, we have these governance platforms that really are the drivers, the IT governance platform that are the driver for our customer market today. So many organizations will have some way of tracking risk and controls in a matrix, in a spreadsheet, and some tool. But I think the challenge our customers are reporting to us, and where we're really solving interesting problems that are improving their, cyber threats, their segregation of duty controls, data privacy, etc. So that's our access platform. Our monitoring platform is a continuous controls monitoring platform, especially in these times where customers are working remotely and they're looking to get better visibility and clarity and confidence in their organization and their operations. This is a great platform to help customers get that visibility and continuously monitor for risk events, and then proactively implement controls. So hoping to make our customers move from a reactive informal stage to a more formal and optimized stage. SafePaaS enables you to then build out those complete processes, for example, a financial close process, so that as you close your books, the controls that are involved in assurance over those financial statements, those controls get executed and tested as the financial statements are closed, and also removing any bottlenecks in the process to optimize your key processes, whether it's financial close, procurement, customer management, etc. Safe Insight is our predictive analytics capabilities. We're really excited about that. There's a lot of new applications coming to the market, and that's where you can kind of slice and dice data from many data sources, identify risk events that you may have missed, and being able to predict that in the future. So it's data analytics, it's big data, it's all that AI capability that enables you to move your organization faster and make it leaner and agile. So that's in a nutshell what we do. Emma is on the call with us, and she can help you get more information and case studies on our customers. Brian, we can move on.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. So what's the challenge then that we're looking at? So when I was setting this session up, I wanted to find something that linked digital transformation and business process management with the whole area of risk, compliance, and control. And there was a recent survey published by BPM Trends, State of Business Process Management, and within that, they identified that digital transformation and cloud computing is obviously having a significant impact on the way that business processes are managed and organizations work. 71% of the respondents cited that change as being key to their businesses. The survey also pointed out that productivity improvements, improving customer satisfaction, and effective use of IT, effective management of IT resources, e.g. ERP applications, were major drivers for organizations focusing on business process change. However, only 36% were satisfied with their ability to monitor process execution. 64% of them were not satisfied with that ability. And most have not actually mapped the majority of their processes. So over 68% of people have mapped out less than half of their business processes. And there's always that thing that says, if you can't see it, if you can't envisage it, then how can you manage it? And the final factor that I think really tipped the balance on this was that only 20% of the respondents identified risk and compliance as a driver or a consideration. So Demonstrating effective business controls, managing compliance, managing risk is, I think, as we all know, is becoming increasingly important to many organizations. We brought together a panel here to give some advice, some experience on how to look at risk, how to look at process controls, as well as the steps that can be taken to ensure that the management of risk, compliance and controls becomes an embedded part of a business's operating model, and also an embedded part of the technology management, cloud technology management operating model as well. So with that context in mind, Searchlight working with SafePaaS, what we've done is invited a panel of experienced business and technology leaders. We tried to take a range of organizations, a range of experiences, to discuss what the future holds for this area of risk, compliance and controls, as we look at cloud, digital transformation and technology-enabled change in general. So we're going to be asking 5 critical questions and the impact that they have on this area and how they support realization of the benefits of digital transformation. We're going to look at some of the recent challenges that organizations have faced, that our panelists have experienced. We're going to look at whether the increased adoption of cloud-based applications, anything as a service offerings, how they affect the future and affect the ability to implement, affect risk, compliance and control. Of course, we want to look at some of the good practices. How do you identify and manage key risk indicators, process indicators? And then what are the critical capabilities that organizations need to develop in the short and the medium term to make sure that GRC and control objectives are embedded into day-to-day operations? And if you're in a GRC leadership position, if you're in one of the people that's tended to lead on governance and risk and compliance and controls, who should you be building your closest alliances with? Finally, we're just going to contemplate whether the whole process, the data management, governance, risk, compliance, whether it needs dedicated organizations, dedicated roles, and or technologies to be effective. So let's introduce our panelists then. We're looking at this, firstly an apology. Zona Smith from FatFace unfortunately is unable to join us today. She's busy working through some of the business and IT scenarios for operational ramp up at FatFace when we come out of the lockdown period. So sincere apologies for that. But we have got David Bottomley and Navinda Kaplish. So I'll ask them to do very quick introductions of themselves. David?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is David Bottomley. I've been the IT director for Specsavers in Northern Europe for the past 5 years. Specsavers are a global opticians and audiology business, and I've been working out in the Nordics and the Netherlands, responsible for all of the IT from strategy through change, through operations and service, and increasingly, of course, the implementation of compliance and the concern around risk and security.
Thanks, David. Nav.
Hello, everyone. Navinda Kaplish here. So my background is governance, risk, and compliance. I have led various projects across the world, worked at Deloitte and Ernst & Young, so 2 of the big 4, and currently a partner at Adan Corporate, whereby we serve small and medium enterprises from a risk advisory perspective globally.
Thank you, Nav. Thanks, Nav. So let's get into the panel discussion then, and let's move on to our first question. So this first question, what I'd like is briefly, if I could ask each panelist to describe one significant challenge that their organization is facing or has recently faced, or people that the organizations that they've worked with, the implications for process, data controls, risk and compliance, and as a quick follow-on, how that's relevant to companies that are forming their digital transformation strategies or undertaking strategic technology-enabled change. Can I start with you, David?
Yeah, Brian. So in the last 18 months in my time as IT director of Specsavers, we faced a new compliance regulation in one of our countries in Norway, where we had to comply with some retail tax and audit regulations on a fixed deadline. the challenge was that the systems that we had in Norway were 25-year-old legacy systems, which were never designed or envisaged to have to cope with fairly detailed changes to make them compliant. So we were faced with two options. One was to try to work with the old technology to introduce compliance, but the option we took was to take the opportunity of a necessary compliance project to replace the systems, and this is software and data in each individual store, and if you like, to make a virtue out of a necessity. So we took that option to our board of directors. We negotiated a elongation of the compliance deadline. My experience that as many compliance deadlines can be negotiated if you have a clear intention and plan to meet the compliance. And to cut a very long story short, we met the deadline, replaced the systems in all of our stores, and landed with a technical platform that was in a far better place. It was our global retail Specsavers product rather than one we'd inherited by acquisition, and we addressed the compliance at the same time. So I guess quick answer to your second point, Brian, is that compliance, while it's a necessary evil, if you like, can present an opportunity to justify a wider business improvement, a digital transformation project, as well as meeting the compliance deadline in our case.
That's great. Great, thank you, David. Thanks, that's really good. Nav, in the organisations and clients that you're working with, are you seeing some different challenges that you can relate to the topic?
Yes. So a recent example. So a client of mine, which is a global telecom company, they're based out of North America, Africa, and Europe. They got listed on the stock exchange in the US, the NASDAQ, and as part of that move, there is something that called as Sarbanes-Oxley compliance that you need to comply with. So it's mandatory for every listed company in the US, which resulted in significant changes to the way the business was run, because the business in the past was run pretty autonomously in every single operation, whereby now we had to make changes to centralize a lot of those processes and controls. So especially in your financial accounting and procurement processes. So that was a really large transformation program, and digital transformation was a part of that. From a risk and compliance perspective, this was mandatory. You have to be SOX compliant and you can't fail it. From a cost perspective, we had to be very mindful, because some of the changes would have resulted in significant costs to centralize various systems and hardware and personnel costs. So decisions were taken to move towards the cloud and use some software as a service applications. So that journey was quite interesting. At the end of it, of course, we passed compliance, and a lot of lessons learned during that exercise. But digital transformation is here to stay, and cloud offerings are here to stay. So how you evaluate risk and compliance for those areas is a new field. So we can talk a little bit more about that in future questions, Brian.
Great, thanks, Nav. Adil, would you like to summarise what you've heard and maybe share some of your experiences as well?
Yeah, I think you heard in summary, two great justification of why companies move, to borrow a word from David, why companies move to a new digital platform, right? It's and they're both music to my ears, because they're compliance, and that's what we do, right? So compliance is an agent of change. It's not the only agent. We all know that. There are many other reasons through M&As and other things that occur in an organization's life cycle, but it is an important agent. So if you are looking to move to a more digital platform, it may be compliance like the Sarbanes-Oxley, or a tax, or some other reason why old systems just can't scale to the current challenges of your compliance need. And more timely, I'll just add to that, in today's environment, risk has become more prominent, front and center in terms of boards and senior management's ability to execute in these challenging times. So risk has become just as important, and I'll talk a little bit about risk when we talk about the key risk indicators. So yeah, compliance and risk are key factors in helping you transform to a digital platform. Unfortunately, as you saw from the BPM study, once companies use these initiatives as business justifications, they don't embed them into their key processes, and that's where that the study really helps us bring that to the center of our discussion today. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's something we've seen as well, Adil, where clients might identify the need up front, but almost forget about it until the end, and then want to almost bolt on governance and risk and compliance monitoring at the end, and realize that they haven't built in some of the key things that they need along the way. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a while. So we talked about these external technical change driving and contributing in this space. Now, if I look at media analysts and commentators, they almost seem to be press ganging organizations into adopting cloud-based technology solutions with almost a fear of missing out mentality. What are your perspectives on the significance of cloud and as a service as it affects processes, data, and the associated risk, compliance, and control considerations? Nav, you've been working, you mentioned a client in the communications market. What's the impact of digital and cloud having on that organization's ability to manage compliance and risk?
Actually, this is an excellent question, Bryan, and I'd like to sort of take a step back and share a wider experience. So at Adan, we've been working with clients in India and Europe around risk and compliance focused on the cloud. And I could argue a case either ways. Now, you said, you very rightly pointed out that people seem to be pushing you in a direction of the media and the hype is around cloud, but there are some very real risks we need to be mindful of as well. So if you're a CTO or a CIO and you've got budgetary pressures, this is a very attractive proposition. You can definitely find financial savings, cost savings moving to the cloud, but I think there is context to be applied here. I think you need to think about the industry you're in. You need to think about how relevant or how significant data is to your organization. So for example, if you're in the insurance industry and you outsource some key processes and data storage to the cloud, to which you have 99, you have providers saying 99% availability, but if the links go down and for whatever reason, human error or technical error or security issues, your data gets wiped out, you can't run your business. You absolutely can't run your business. So in that case, if you're a CTO, in the business case, other than cost savings, maybe you should consider having a hybrid model whereby you have data replication locally, maybe done real time, maybe done daily. So other sectors like defense, public sector, banking, I don't think everybody is going to move lock, stock, and barrel to the cloud. I think there'll have to be a risk-based approach taken about which data and which processes you move. On the other hand, there are some very valid reasons for moving processes and data that are perhaps not mission critical and that you can get savings off. So I can see both sides of the coin, and I do think that businesses should evaluate independently, not just taking the cost factor into consideration, but the risks and compliance, which doesn't happen normally, Bryan, in my experience.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, David. David, how's this trend affecting the businesses that you work with in Specsavers?
Yeah, I think just to add what we've heard, really, I think from a retail point of view, the cloud is advantage from all directions. I mean, from a business perspective, as an international retailer working across e-commerce, B2B, and with stores, then the cloud gives the opportunity clearly to internationalize your business and to present a seamless customer journey, whether you're starting that journey online, in a shop, finishing it online, or in a shop. So our cloud strategy and digital transformation strategy was business driven, but from a control, risk and compliance point of view, it only makes things easier. I mean, I inherited 5 years ago systems in a region which were different in each country, with local data, regional data, centralized data, on-prem data, a little bit of cloud data, and processes which were different in different markets. So standardization, centralization, brings simplicity, makes compliance, risk and control easier to manage and to address, and has the cost-saving benefits and the resilience benefits that Nav's mentioned as well. So all positive. The move is getting there's a challenge, but the end game is well worth it.
Great, thank you. Adil, what are you experiencing with some of the other organisations that you work with?
Yeah, so I'll extend on the couple of themes that the panelists have just laid out. So, Navinder talks about take a risk-based approach, talks about, it's industry specific, it's not moving everything to the cloud. And then I think, David, you made a good point about, it's got to have some benefit to the customer ultimately, right? So in retail, that's a fantastic example of a omni-channel benefit, and it leads to cost savings, which is so important when you're Amazoned. So I think if you just build on that, a couple of more examples in the same direction. We have a customer in Denmark that's one of the top universities in Europe that has decided to move to the cloud because not because of operational improvements, but basically because of data privacy risks they had determined in their current hosting environment. So by moving to a cloud vendor like SafePaaS, and I'll be on the other side of this table, right? We are a cloud player. So we see both customers that are on premise as well as in cloud, and we serve them both categories of customers. So what we see with this customer is that they felt that by having their data in a SOC 1 certified environment where they have third-party audits performed at no cost to them, as part of built-in cost of the cloud supplier, not just the hardware and software and access, but we also provide the assurances through third-party firms. So that was an example of why they moved to, they've engaged SafePaaS and why they exist in the cloud. They put their data and secure that in the cloud. And then from a digital transformation perspective, which is a theme of today's session, the cost savings is a big benefit. So one of the things that comes with that cost saving is the change management cost, right? If you imagine like a common client that Navinder and I have worked with most recently, sitting across the table from each other, change management is a big part of that cost. So having support.
You're talking about systems change management here, Adil?
Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, so I'm talking about those changes that are part of your SDLC software development lifecycle, right? Your IT general controls. Those controls can now be transferred to the supplier. It comes with its own challenges for the business. So being able to have good visibility into those controls, but there are benefits. So you have to sort of weigh in the benefits and cost. And as I mentioned, some of our customers will remain on premise if that formula does not make sense for their major ERP systems like SAP, etc. Others are adopting cloud. Just to quote a percentage, just to give you an idea of what I'm seeing in the market. So when we were putting together our plan for 2020, we gathered data from MarketWatch, and we've done some webinars on cloud prior to this one. And what we find is the cloud ERP systems like Workday, Oracle ERP Cloud are growing at about 23 to 25% according to MarketWatch, whereas the on-premise systems are declining at about 3% or so. So that's another factor to consider. Where the market is going.
Yeah, and we're seeing similar things, and that impact on the technology operating model, not only just configuration and software change management, but all the testing associated with that, and the ability to maintain controls so that there's consistency across the different parts of the landscape that you have, because I think seldom these days do we find clients running with a single big behemoth business application. It tends to be multiple applications, some of which will be in the cloud and some of them maybe still on premise. So let's move on to our next question then. And we talked a bit about how change, technology-enabled change is adding complexity to that, managing the risk and compliance and the effective control of data and processes. But we probably need to talk about one fundamental thing, and that's how do you go about identifying the key risks, the indicators in the first place. Adil, I'll come back to you as a start point. Can you provide an overview of how KRIs, key risk indicators, operational indicators, and key controls can be identified so that they can actually be factored into the design of change programs?
Yes, of course. So, this is where we live and breathe as SafePaaS. That's part of our mission. And so we spend a lot of time talking to our customers top down in the organization. So at the most strategic level, it's about risk is all about the identifying those challenges that keep you from executing your strategy, right? That's by definition what risk is. So it's by definition a strategic issue. From then onwards down, once you lay out your obstacles at the strategic level, you start to look at execution, more tactical risk, which is your operational risks. So operational risks are typically lead to the risk within each process, as we've asked in this question. So for example, in your procure to pay cycle, what's the risk that three-way match doesn't occur? So it gets pretty tactical, pretty solid. And those controls have been in place in many well-run organizations since the beginning. That's why they're successful. So operational risk comes down out of that guidance that starts with the strategic risk. And in today's environment, it's about financial reporting and disclosure. If any sizable organization that takes investment, they need to be able to give guarantees and assurances to their banks and their stakeholders. And as we said was earlier, if you're listed on a stock exchange, to the stock exchange. But that's the financial controls, the financial risk, which sort of grew to a lot of attention back in 2003 and onwards with Sarbanes-Oxley here in the U.S. and other financial regulations around the world. So financial risk is really important for our customers, and then an IT system which are pervasive, right? They provide you controls across your ERP and your digital transformation process. So that's where some of these key risk indicators come in. What we to help our customers do is take that top-down approach and work with our partners like Searchlight and others to basically put together a category of risk, and within those categories, go through a analysis of likelihood and impact to determine what risks are important, and then help them implement controls that mitigate, monitor, remediate those risks. So that's in a nutshell how we approach the KRI for our customers.
Great, thank you, Adil. Thanks. And David, what steps did you take early on in Specsavers to identify the key factors that needed to be addressed during the project and to help deliver that change that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I think two major steps, Brian. I mean, the first step is to make sure that risk, compliance, and control get into your annual or 3-yearly planning process, or whatever planning process your business has. Historically, they get squeezed out by slightly more exciting projects around sales increases or cost reduction or market share improvements. We got to a stage in Specsavers where risk, compliance, and control were very much on the agenda of our planning process, and well sponsored by functional directors who understood the importance of addressing risk and compliance early on, and making sure they got the investments in competition with some of those more appealing projects. Having got through that point, and that's really important to make sure that these projects are visible rather than just things that become an afterthought when some of the risks start to materialize, is then to start those projects really early. And one lesson we learned with the project I mentioned in Norway, we really should have started a bit earlier. Same with GDPR. Many organizations knew the deadline but started late, and of course, the sooner you start, the sooner you finish, rather than have a dash to the line at the end. And then in terms of, just briefly, in terms of individual projects, obviously to make sure that the risk and compliance requirements are explicitly included and costed in the program, and clearly sponsored by the steering group. They're tracked through every stage of the project, through requirements, if it's a technical project, through the build and testing phases, and to make sure the steering group is educated, informed, sponsoring, and committed to making sure those risk mitigation requirements, or those compliance requirements, or those control requirements are delivered with the same focus as the more tangible deliverables at the end of the project.
Great. Thanks, David. Thanks. Nav, any other considerations? Perhaps you could briefly just talk about this 3 lines of defense framework that's shown on the screens at the moment and how that helps in identification of KRIs and control indicators.
Yes, Brian. I think the 3 lines of defense model is a really good way to structure in the organization how you implement risk and how you monitor risk and compliance. And it very much fits into your question around what are some of the good practices that organizations can adopt. So we just heard Dave give some really good examples of how programs are managed and tracked. Adil talked about the compliance drivers. I think this is a model that we use quite often when we go and talk to clients from an ADAN perspective. So the first, it's a best practice model, by the way. It's used by most organizations. So the first line of defense basically is the operational management. So if you take an example of a pharma sector, then this would include processes like inventory management, and you've got somebody sitting in the inventory room executing the processes and following those controls. The second line of defense are basically your risk and compliance professionals, but not just exclusively around access controls and tech controls as we normally think about risk and compliance, but also quality and inspection. Because in the same example of the pharma company, if there's a particular molecule that needs to be maintained at a certain temperature during its life cycle, then there's a control defined around that by the quality team, and the first line of defense, i.e. the operational team, needs to actually execute that and demonstrate that they've maintained that molecule at that temperature. And the third line of defense really is mainly internal audit, because internal audit fulfills a really important role. They are part of the organization, but they independently assess how effectively you've implemented your controls, if you've designed a control that's really good, but actually on the ground it's not being followed at all, then that's a problem. And internal audit, which is why internal audit always has a dotted line to senior management. They report into senior management, maybe the CEO or the CFO, but they always have a dotted line to the audit committee, which in theory is meant to be independent, and they have senior leaders there challenging how the organization's managing its risk and compliance. So the one point I want to make here around good practices is that from a risk and compliance perspective, it's not a sexy area. Like Dave mentioned, it's not something that people want to spend money on. But really, unless you have buy-in right at the top, unless somebody at the top says, actually, we want to monitor these particular indicators, these particular controls, because they're critical to us, you can't really implement a good model successfully. So the 3 lines of defense model is really simple, but really you need buy-in from the top.
Thanks. That's really good. So I think, and we've seen the same thing. We work with a number of pharmaceuticals, life sciences, as well as other industries as well, where that is quite clear that the quality inspection and the process measures are key to them being able to operate fundamentally, but also wanting to be able to look at how they operate more efficiently and more effectively. So it's sort of clear. It seems clear that the demands for and on business process management and risk compliance controls is increasing. How do you embed that? How do you get that attention in the first place, and how do you embed that into the daily operation? What are the capabilities organizations need to develop? And if you're leading on risk and compliance and controls, who do you need to build your coalitions with? Who do you need your alliances? Who needs to be on your side? So perhaps now, briefly, what are your thoughts? Business capabilities, what's needed, and what do people need to add or strengthen?
Okay, so 2 questions there. The first part is actually a segue from the previous slide where I talked about the 3 lines of defense. I think in terms of critical capabilities, absolutely an independent internal audit team and a really good risk and compliance function in whatever shape or form it is for the second line of defense is absolutely critical, whether you're a small organization or a large one, to whatever capacity it's suitable for you. In terms of building coalitions, now this is a really interesting question, because I'm from the risk and compliance background, and I think slightly differently to perhaps somebody like Dave, who's a CTO, CIO on the side of things. I'm basically going to say that the GRC leaders absolutely need to build coalitions with independent directors on the board. potentially investors or shareholders, because at the end of the day, when a business case is presented, we talked about cloud, moving to the cloud before. When a business case is made for moving to the cloud, cost considerations are what get prioritized. But do the investors or do the independent board members, do they realize the risks associated with them? And can somebody take an independent view, which is not just driven by cost savings? Because at the end of the day, if data gets lost or if your system goes down, the worst case scenarios, basically, there is a cost to that negative event. And generally, governance, risk, and compliance professionals must have coalitions with somebody who's independent from the direct management of the business. So even the CEO, I mean, the CEO could move to another business in 2 years' time, and the decisions they've made live with the company forever. So I think that's what I would say. I know it's perhaps a slightly provocative view, but from a risk and compliance perspective, I think those are important relationships.
That's good. David, what's your view in terms of?
Yeah, no, I agree with Navinder entirely. So it's not too provocative from my point of view. I think that what you don't want, and I agree with you, Navinder, the CIO and CTO should not take accountability for risk control and compliance. It needs to be a board level accountability, and as you said, therefore educating and passing that accountability to relevant functional directors or people supporting the business is really important. And probably a way of doing that is, I think, as you've alluded to, is to point out the implications of not being compliant, of not managing risks, and not being in control, and the potential quite disastrous impact on a business in terms of reputational damage, its loss of data, its loss of services, or its inability to trade because it's not compliant to a legislation that needs to be adhered to. So we made that transition at Specsavers, and we got to the point where people like the marketing directors, the CMOs, the CFOs, and the COOs were taking seriously their own accountability. And then it becomes a cultural shift as much as anything, that not only at senior level but all the way through the organisation, people are risk aware and take risk compliance and control seriously. And there's a whole education agenda behind that as well.
Thank you. Adil, anything that you would add to that? Any other stakeholders you think, or any leadership skills you think organizations need to develop?
I think that part of the question, David and Navinder have handled pretty well. I just was pondering on the first part of the question around, what companies do, and thinking back on our recent client engagements, being a supplier of GRC platform, from our standpoint, those short-term objectives are so important as well. Just like this having the right ownership of GRC, we call it a RACI matrix, and I work with a number of clients to help do that. But the objectives that you set out for a digital transformation, GRC is part of those control objectives. Simple things like access controls, that we work with a number of our clients. The first thing you do is you want to secure your data in the cloud. So being able to make sure you have good segregation of duty policies baked into your roles and responsibilities, data privacy, we talked about that, data protection. All of that, those control objectives are important. I had earlier mentioned about change control around system change control. So you're going to be setting up thousands of different configurations to operate your business in the cloud. Are they all signed and sealed and tracked before you go live with your new platform? So those are some of the capabilities in the short to medium term that these stakeholders should consider as well.
That's great. All right, thanks Adil, thanks. Sorry, every time I click on the little control panel, it moves my cursor off the screen share. Just in conclusion then, so as panelists, do you think that organizations need to invest more in what they're doing from a capability perspective in risk compliance and controls? And do you think that needs to be in the form of a dedicated part of the organization, or roles, or is technology really needed in order to be effective? So I know there are no silver bullets, but if you are new to this and you're being tasked with enabling this digital transformation, or at least supporting the risk compliance controls aspects of that. What do you need to do, David? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a balance here, because I think my answer is yes, there do need to be dedicated roles, but I'm just caveating that in as much as the danger of that is that everybody else in the organisation thinks that the person or the organisation within their organisation is worrying about it and they don't need to. So take the example of risk. Everybody needs to be risk aware, but I do think there's a benefit of having a separate risk function. First of all, to coordinate risks across the organisation, to make sure they're reported and managed by the board and operating boards, and to sponsor, to educate, to challenge and coordinate the activity, but without taking away accountability from everybody else in the organisation. You could say the same about compliance. You know, who's waking up every morning worrying about the next compliance deadline that's coming up? Somebody has to have that responsibility, but then that needs to be permeated across the organisation. You need data owners, you need process owners. So I think it's a balance. I think you do need dedicated roles, but you need a culture that supports that as well.
Yeah, Nav, what's your views?
I think it depends on the size of the organization. I think large organizations, I don't see how they can do without a dedicated risk and controls function in today's day and age with so much digitization. I think for medium organizations it's trickier because ideally I mean, it is a cost center at the end of the day, but it comes down to what business they're in and how mature their systems are. So you could perhaps say that they could maybe hire a smaller external firm to come in once in a while and look at their risk and controls. But ideally, any organization, you know, making more than I would say 30-40 million pounds, having a decent size, must absolutely have somebody dedicated to it. I take Dave's point around the fact that if there is somebody, then everybody else assumes it's only that person's problem. But sometimes I've seen that the scale of work and the scale of effort in this area is so significant that it requires dedicated resource. Also, another smart idea that I can perhaps suggest for smaller businesses is to multitask. I mean, you have folks who are IT from an IT background. They can, as part of their role, have some responsibilities around risk and compliance. So, for example, if there's a third-party vendor and your CTO your tech team is a 3-man team with one CTO, the CTO should absolutely know basic things like basic certifications like what is a SOC 1 report, a SOC 2 report, ISO 27001. These are basics that they should be able to monitor so they can hold the third party to account. And also, you know, you can think tangentially here. You have a legal function in the organization. You should take their help to evaluate risks as well, especially with third parties. So it depends on the size of the organization. I mean, smaller companies, I don't see how they can have somebody independent managing this. So yeah.
That's good. Yeah, Adil, have you got anything to add on that or on the technology aspects of this?
Yeah, Brian, so I'd just like to start by saying that I think this is a very important function, right? If you're going to take governance, risk, and compliance seriously, you need to have dedicated resources. Now, I take Navinder's point too, that if you can't, you know, if you want to go to a shared service model or outsource that, you know, that makes sense. But I think, you know, somebody's got to wash the till, right, to make sure that money doesn't slip through it. And governance, risk, and compliance is one of those roles. By no means it's the only group that that should watch the tail, as I said. It should be really the responsibility of that 3 lines of defense that that Navinder talked about on the a couple of slides ago. So we do want to have people coordinate governance, risk, and compliance, but as nature, by nature, it's a pervasive problem. It's not a problem that you can isolate to one group, as David said. So you have to kind of make that to make it sustainable. You really have to make it part of doing business. You know, this is what we do each day as businesses, and so it's embedded into your process. That's the ideal, most sustainable way of doing, which means your control owners that actually perform the process should own those controls, whether it's governance, risk, or compliance, and then on a periodic basis certify those controls. Right, that's the most sustainable manner. And this is one of the questions where we help customers build out, you know, a kind of a responsibility, accountability, you know, consultative, et cetera, metrics, essentially, where there's a participation from the IT organization, there's participation from your audit organization, the bid lines of defense, the finance organization. So it's really a enterprise problem, and it starts by having really good sponsorship at the top. But at the same token, I would strongly suggest to consider having that dedicated role so that there is coordination. On the other hand, I would also say I've seen companies fail with GRC platforms and products when only those GRC people assigned to the GRC project and the GRC platform are considered quote unquote responsible for GRC, right? Because then you've got 2 or 3 people in the organization, you have a turnover, the rest of the organization doesn't know how to really use the platform or apply those techniques, and then you have a failure years down the line. So don't leave it to those folks, but definitely have that central coordination.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I've seen as well is that it's also needs to be clear that those dedicated roles or that function is there to help the business to manage that risk and compliance. It's there to do maybe some of the monitoring or to recommend when things should be done. But the danger is they become almost like the gatekeeper to change. And we have seen clients where, so a pharmaceuticals client we worked with fairly recently, where the quality department had such an iron grip around the business that to move them onto more digitized processes was actually a real challenge, because the quality team needed to undertake some really significant organizational change management to get them to agree and accept that they weren't exposing themselves to more risk or more compliance issues. So I think you also have to be careful that if you are dedicating it, that you don't they don't act as a complete gatekeepers. So anyway, so that brings us to the end of the discussion really. So we've great discussion. Thanks guys. That's really good. We've looked at risk compliance controls. We've looked at it in the context of digital transformation and technology and change programs that go on. The panelists will talk through some of the challenges, the implications of cloud, how to go about risk, identifying risk and process control indicators. And then those last couple of questions talking about some of the organizational capabilities, the organizational structures and the roles that we have between that. So Emma, I think we've got a few minutes, a bit of time for some questions.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. Is there full visibility of the project before digital transformation projects, and how can you then budget correctly? This is a question for each of the panel members.
Who wants to jump in on that one?
I'm not sure I quite got the question, Emma.
Do you want me to repeat that, David?
Please, yes, yeah, I can jump in.
Okay, yeah. Is there full visibility of the project before digital transformation, and how can you then budget correctly for the project?
So, I mean, maybe I'll let's see if I can interpret that one myself. So, I think that when you set out on any journey and digital transformation, technology-enabled change, any of these programs, much in the same way that the overall objectives of governance, risk, and compliance is to enable the business strategy. So I think that in terms of providing visibility, up front, when you're defining that roadmap, when you're defining the outcomes that you want to achieve, you need to include the risk and compliance and control outcomes that you want to achieve right from the get-go. And in the normal way that you would then do it, you would then look to say what's the cost of that risk if you want to build it into a business case. So if we can mitigate that risk, what's the benefit that mitigating that risk gives us? And this is something I think both David, Navinda and Adil have talked to. But then what are the costs associated with that as well? So I think the answer to that, if we've interpreted the question properly, is that you should strive for visibility of these issues up front because they are important outcomes that your program needs to deliver. And in terms of including them in the business case, then it's about placing a value on those, on the risks or the compliance considerations, and factoring in the costs of addressing those. I don't know if anyone else would agree with that and wants to add to it.
No, I agree, Brian. Just to add, there is an opportunity, I think, with any transformation program to develop solutions which are generically more capable of handling compliance requirements, even if you don't know what the next one is. So that's something to consider. So you may well know there's 2 compliance requirements coming along, but how do you build a system that is easier to change or more flexible for future compliance requirements? I think you should.
And that applies in terms of the mindset around building or implementing systems and processes that have the abilities to adapt and flex with the business, don't they? Yeah. Is there another question?
Will COVID-19 introduce any newer controls for business continuity in pandemics?
Almost certainly.
Yes. Yes.
Nav, do you want to go at that one?
Yeah, I mean, COVID-19 has changed so many paradigms that it's undoubtedly it'll have an impact on risk and compliance and how it's managed. I mean, there are all sorts of new angles coming up which we didn't consider before. So, for example, if you're with the cloud service provider and you've outsourced some of your key processes and data to that provider, do you even know which country they're based out of? I mean, if they're based in a country that is now suffering severely with COVID-19 and staff aren't there to manage services effectively, well, you've got a bit of a problem. Also, there's a political angle. I mean, tomorrow, if the US-China trade wars and other spats, if they escalate, and you're an American company that has, I don't know, hypothetical situation, if you've got some services based out of China, does that make an impact? I mean, on your assessment about politically how you should be looking at risk and compliance? Because at the end of the day, you need to have your systems available. Availability is key and functional, and you should be able to guarantee that that there are no issues from a security and compliance perspective. Those are 2 examples I can think of, but there are many other aspects that undoubtedly will come to the fore in the coming months.
Yeah, I wonder how many organisations would have thought that a pandemic like this was sort of an uncontrollable risk that they would I don't know what's the term for it in risk management, that they would just accept and that hadn't really factored things like this into their business continuity plans. But it's a big topic. We've probably got time for one more question, I think. I think we've got a few questions.
Yep, okay. My question is, how do you deal with the challenge of those people in the enterprise who do have an iron hold in the organization that are really objecting to the digital transformation?
Adil, have you got a comment on that?
I figure you should, Brian, lead that, but I will add my experience with it. So clearly, this goes back to the leadership and sponsorship, right? So if you have a strong leadership vision around why you're moving to this journey, I think you need to get that buy-in way before you bring in folks like SafePaaS, right? When we show up, we are the agents of change, so we have been brought in to execute the change. But if I look at success versus failure among our customer projects, the successful projects are those where those obstacles are handled at the top level, and so the sponsors are very involved. There's ongoing communication between the sponsors through a steering committee, let's say, and so there's some tools available to us to deal with that. Change is tough, as Brian, the practitioner, you would be able to comment on that. But from a technology platform, we are the agents of change, so we see the outcomes of well-run top-down sponsored projects versus where change management really slows down and hampers the opportunity for improvement. And I think one tool that we find very helpful is that effective steering committee communication, to bring up those points early and often, and let the sponsor get involved and sometimes reassert the vision, because there are times where there will be tech failures within a project. There will be things that people expected or misunderstood, and things aren't going as you had all seen in the rosy pictures, right? So that's the real world why we live in. Yeah. And I think having good sponsorship is one thing that helps us make that change more effective for our customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spend quite a lot of time at the beginning of our programs making sure that the senior leadership team is aligned around those the objectives, and that if there are any objections, that they're dealt with right up front. And sometimes we've even taken the path of addressing those one-to-one with the sponsor and any protagonists. I even had one colleague who did recommend that somebody should be fired in order for this program to be successful. I'm not sure I go that far a lot of the time, but anyway, so that's good now. Emma, do you want to just closing remarks and a bit of housekeeping for us? We're on the hour now.
Yep, thank you, Bryan. I'd just like to say a big thank you to our panelists, Nav and David, for your thought-provoking contributions today, and to Adil and Bryan, of course, from Searchlight for hosting the event, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We will be taking the discussion and preparing a discussion paper around the topic that you've seen today. Just give us a few days, week maybe, to prepare that for you, and we'll get that out to you. The recording will be available. I'll be sending out a follow-up email after the event. And if, Bryan, you'd like to switch to the next slide, we do have contact details. Well, if you do have any further questions, then you can get in touch with myself, Emma, here at SafePaaS. You can contact us through our website, LinkedIn, and I just once again thank you to our panelists, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.